Hello there, my name's Kevin Ryan.
And I'm Adrian Pauley.
And we put together this program on the persuasive oral with a particular focus on helping students who are addressing the task known as IA2 in the Queensland curriculum. And Adrian, you've been speaking to a lot of teachers and heads of department about this particular task and encountered some of the common problems, haven't you?
I have indeed.
And we found that students were making some fairly common problems right at the very start, which tended to throw them off track. And first of all, I think they didn't really understand which audience they were speaking to. And IA2 actually asks you to nominate a specific audience. So you need to be able to understand who your audience is, because if you can't understand your audience, you can't analyze them. If you can't analyze them, you can't understand how to be able to engage them, to be able to interest them, and most of all, to be able to persuade them. And then they also need to be able to understand what they're going to ask of this audience, don't they?
Correct, yes.
And this is a persuasive oral. And so at the end of a persuasive oral, the audience is expected to think or act differently to the way they were at the start of the oral. That is the definition of a successful persuasive oral. So you need to be able to decide not only who your audience are so you can analyze them, but once you understand that, understand clearly what your task is going to be, what you are going to try and persuade them of by the end of your presentation. And we put together a program that's going to help students to be able to be confident that they've addressed this task the most successful way that they can.
And step one is audience analysis.
And in that audience analysis, what you need to be able to do is understand your audience maybe according to their demographic, and you can see the list of criteria there that you might consider regarding that, or maybe their behaviours. We've had some students, for example, suggest an audience that might be the youth attendees at a United Nations conference.
Yes.
And so the demographic would be fairly clear. That would be people probably between the ages of maybe 15 and 19 or 25. And then their behaviours would be the kind of people who might want to spend their time attending a conference such as this. And it would give you some idea about what their interests are, wouldn't it?
Yes, and that is very, very vital in terms of having a great persuasive oral.
You need to be able to understand what interests them.
You do. And if you look at that slide there on the screen, you can see that the people who come into the audience have their own individual interests. And your task as the speaker is to find that little piece in the middle that is common to all the participants.
It is no good being able to address maybe 1/3 of the audience or even 2/3 of the audience if you're going to alienate or disinterest a certain section of your audience. And being able to identify that tiny little overlap, and in a way, Adrian, it's good, isn't it, if that overlap is quite small, because that gives you a sharp focus. And many teachers have commented that they feel that their students' presentations lack focus.
Yeah, they do lack focus, and it's partly because they've gone too wide, too large in their thoughts about what topic they want to speak about.
So you need to be able to find their common interests, their common values, their common beliefs and concerns, and being able to use that as the focus for going on to step 2, which is
consider your topic. And our slide here basically gives you 7 key topics that have to be up there as ones that students would most likely choose.
It's very unlikely that you'll be using a topic that doesn't fall into one of those 7 categories. You need to be able to understand what is your audience's attitude towards your topic. Their attitude might be positive towards your topic, in which case you can build on that and be able to maybe enthusiastically encourage them to be able to follow through on their already positive attitude. They might be negatively inclined towards your particular topic, in which case you have some resistance there, but you also have the opportunity to be able to change some mindsets, change some attitudes, change the way that people look at a certain aspect. or they could be disinterested. And in our experience, choosing a topic where you are concerned that the audience may be disinterested in it is probably not the wisest choice for students when they're choosing a topic for their oral presentation. Wouldn't you agree, Adrian?
Yes. Try and encourage the students to go with either positive or disinterested or negative.
Yeah, because if you've got that, then you know you've got a topic where you are more confident about the material that you'll be able to use. You don't get any extra points for choosing a difficult topic. Choose a topic, once you know who your audience is and have decided who your audience is, choose a topic that you think is going to be good to work with your particular audience. Or if you've already been provided with a topic as part of your task, then choose an audience that you think is going to have a positive or an interested attitude towards your particular topic. And their interests, their values, their beliefs and concerns will be reflected in the individual views on a topic.
Correct. And that diagram again is we're looking for that small part in the middle which gives us common views on this topic. And if they can understand that, then their audience analysis and their effect on the audience will be so much greater. And we have a booklet that we've produced for this IA2 presentation, and it covers that particular aspect of the presentation, audience analysis.
And so if you want to think about your audience and you want to follow this booklet and use this booklet as a way of being able to put together your presentation, you would use the space on page 5 there, which is headed step 1, what does your audience have in common, and be able to identify all of those particular factors. You would then move forward onto step 2, where there's space on page 7 for you to be able to nominate your topic. And that way you've got the first 2 steps covered and addressed in your handbook there. There are also ways in which you can make your presentation more interesting to your audience and also help you meet the specific requirements of IA2, because they ask you to address a recent issue, don't they?
They do, within the last 12 months.
So think about what are recent events about my particular topic that I might be able to refer to. What is maybe is there some relevance to the place where I'm going to be delivering this presentation? Can I make some reference to people who might be present in the audience? This helps you to be able to not only meet the requirements of this particular task, but also gives you much more confidence that your presentation will be relevant and interesting to your audience. It is only when you are confident that your topic and your content is interesting to your audience that you can deliver it with any degree of confidence. You don't want to bore your audience. And most people bore their audience by not understanding their audience, don't they?
Correct, they do.
Yeah. So what they do is they don't understand their audience, and so they overcompensate with a data dump, with too much information. One of the most common complaints we have from teachers.
Yes, too much information, and try and focus down onto that one key area.
So being able to understand who your audience is, what their interests are, and being able to identify how they might think about your particular topic will allow you to be able to have that sharp focus, which then allows you to move on to the next step.
And step 3 is call to action. Now, a persuasive speech must have a call to action, otherwise we don't have a persuasive speech. Now, normally this comes at the conclusion of a speech, but Kevin and I have decided to put this very early on because we believe that if students know where they're going to end up at their journey, they're much more likely to be focused on as they go through the journey. And Kevin really talks about it in a couple of different ways.
You need to be able to understand where you're actually going with your presentation. And the trouble for most students is that they think about their presentation, they write their presentation, they prepare their presentation, and they deliver their presentation in the same order, from the start right through to the end. What you'll notice here is we're actually having you write the concluding part of your presentation as step 3 in a 9-step process. We have totally decoupled that illogical connection, because we have found that if you think about this particular part at the start of your presentation, as the late great Dr. Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind, then it makes it much easier for us to be able to choose our material. It makes us much easier to be able to work towards a strong conclusion. And again, another common complaint we've heard from teachers, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that the presentations just fade away and leave them confused as to what was the whole point of the presentation.
Yes. They end with a whimper rather than a bang. And the slide, as you can see, there's what you ask them to do, your audience, what you ask them to do will make them act differently or think differently, and that becomes your call to action.
So this is a logical step. You've thought about your audience and what are their common points. You've thought about your topic and what your audience's attitude might be towards that particular topic. Now, based on those two understandings, you can then move on to what are you going to ask of them in the time allotted to you, and what can you reasonably ask them to actually think differently or to act differently as part of your persuasive presentation. To be able to help you put that into context, here's a sample idea that we've thought of. You might be talking to the delegates to a conference which is entitled The Future of Australia. Obviously, because they're attending that conference, their points in common would be a concern for the future of our nation. And you might then decide, given that, I think a fair call to action might be to ask them to contribute to a fund to expand research into innovation in the outback. Or to think of a second example, we might think about attendees at a ceremony for a famous Vietnam battle. What they might have in common, it might be concern for the health of returning service personnel. And you might ask them as your call to action to support a movement for more support from the government for soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You can, as long as you think clearly about who are your audience, what do they have in common, and then what are you going to ask them to think or act differently about by the end of your presentation, then you can have a clear focus which takes you on to the next step.
And step 4 are motivators. Now, Kevin and I have done quite a great deal of work in establishing what might be some key motivators. We want to take you through a number of those right now.
There are a huge number of motivators. We've researched all of the persuasion and influencing research that's been done over the last 50 years, but we've also gone back 2,500 years, haven't we, Adrian?
We have.
To Aristotle. Aristotle in Rhetoric, the first book where somebody wrote down the aspects necessary for people to be engaging and persuasive with their audience. Obviously, giving you the total results of our research would have us giving you over 50 motivators, and that would not help you. So what we've done is identify the ones that we think you can most readily use for the type of presentation you're going to be doing. So again, let's very quickly go back over those steps. You now understand your audience. You understand what you're going to be speaking to them about. You've decided what you're going to ask them to do as your call to action at the end of this presentation. So now the next question is, given that you're going to ask them to do that, and given your understanding of this audience, what is it that's most likely to make them do it? And that will be one or more of these particular motivators. Those are described in your handout there on pages
8, 9, and 10.
8, 9, and 10. Justice and fairness, safety and security, threat of loss, altruism, which is our concern for people other than ourselves, mastery, our desire to be truly good at something, FOMO, we all understand about fear of missing out, ego, belonging, we are gregarious animals as human beings, we like to be part of a group, and competitiveness. And so think about your audience the way that we've asked you to so far in this seminar, and then ask yourself these questions of your audience through the prism of the topic that you'll be speaking to them about. First question, What wrong do they want to fix? What do they need to feel safe about? What could they lose? Who do they care about? What do they want to be good at? What could they miss out on? What do they want to look good at? What group do they want to be part of? And who do they want to beat? To be able to put that into context, here's a example of that first example we gave you before about the conference on the Great Barrier Reef. And the three motivators you might choose from there might be the threat of loss, that we could lose up to 2/3 of the reef if sea levels keep rising, the justice and fairness of how we might not be able to leave this environment for future generations, or mastery about how we need to become more masterful at managing our fragile planet. And you would have maybe one of those as your primary focus, wouldn't you, Adrian?
Yeah.
And then another two as alternative or as backups to be able to support that. You wouldn't use more than three, but we've given you 8, so as you can feel confident that you'll have enough there for any topic and any audience.
Which then leads us on to step 5, which is your key statement. And your students need to have this key statement, which is about 1 or 2 sentences only. It comes out of the motivators. And if I could use in the example, if at the end of the speech, as the audience were walking out and someone said, what was the key message of that speech? And if most people in that audience were able to give the same key idea, you would know that their message had got through. So that's one way in which if you don't have a key statement, your persuasive speech is really lacking.
The key statement helps you to be able to have that sharpness and that focus that we've already referred to. Excuse me. As Adrian said, you need to be able to put it into one short, succinct sentence, one sentence that they will remember. Think about the speakers that you've heard throughout your life. With most of them, you will struggle to remember anything that they said. And if you could remember one thing that they said, they would probably be more successful than most other speakers that you've actually heard. You want to be one of the speakers that is more successful than others that your audience has heard. And the way that you can do this is by having them remember one thing that you said. You don't let them decide what that is. You decide what it is. And you put it into that one short, succinct statement, which will be repeated, won't it, Adrian?
Yes. You'd probably hear it 3 times, Kevin, do you think, in the course of the speech? Yeah,
at least probably in the opening, somewhere close to the opening, at least once, maybe even as a connecting theme throughout the body of your presentation, and definitely it should be there in the conclusion. Yeah. It is not the call to action. It informs the call to action, but it's not the call to action, is it?
No.
No. It's the reason why they should adhere to your call to action. It's the reason why they are most likely to do what you are going to ask them to do. Not because of anything you've imposed on them, but because of your understanding of what actually motivates them.
Which then leads us on to step 6. And step 6 is the support material. And again, there are many, many ideas and data that students can use, but they need to find some ways of managing their key statement with support material. We would like to give you a few examples.
Now, first of all, think about the model that we've got here, which I think you could actually describe maybe as an octopus model. In other words, everything that is the support material in those little yellow boxes links directly back to the key statement. A lot of people write their presentations where one piece of support material links to the second one, links to the third one, and it very quickly becomes confusing. It lacks focus, and it makes the audience wonder what the whole thing is all about. Whereas if you have that key statement, which is why it's there at that part of the particular program. If you have that key statement, and then you make sure that every piece of support material doesn't link just to the other pieces of support material, but actually links back to that key statement, then you can be confident that people are going to be able to follow and understand what you have to say to them.
For example, logical appeal, giving them some facts and some figures. And going along with that is emotional appeal, where you invoke the feelings from the audience with examples. And that links back to that key idea we talked about with logos and pathos with Aristotle. You then have social proof. You might give a story from someone who's similar to them so that connects with the audience. You might use positive labeling and complimenting the group as to what they may have done or what they have about to do.
So, for example, Adrian, if they've been very generous at supporting our cause in the past, then you might compliment them for their generosity, because you're going to ask them to be generous again. Yeah.
2 words, just imagine, are very, very powerful in our language. And if you can describe the desired future you have, it will be a much more powerful presentation. And Kevin has a very good quote that he likes to use.
Yeah, wonderful quote from Dr. Noel Tichy, Professor of Management from the University of Western Ontario. And that is, if you ever want people to go into new and uncharted territory, take them there first in their imaginations. In other words, you are going to ask people to go into a better world, because they're going to adhere to your call to action in your persuasive presentation to be able to create a better world. Paint a picture in their minds of what this better world is going to be like once they acquiesce to your call to action, and you're more likely to get them to do what you're going to ask of them. You need to think of your audience's mind as a series of blank canvases, and with the words that you will actually share with them, you are painting word pictures on that canvas, because images last much longer in the audience's mind than words do, and images feed the part of the mind that are most responsible for decision making. And that is why I love the way that Adrian started with the logical appeal, the statistics, the facts, the data that you can share with them, but he immediately put it beside the emotional appeal, because logic makes them think, but emotion makes them act.
And commitment and consistency, Kevin, how does that fit in?
Well, it fits in with the fact that if they've already made a commitment to some particular ideal or some particular concept, then you just remind them about that, and remind them that this is now a way in which they can honour their word. For example, at the school, you have a school motto. Every student at that school believes in that school motto. They wear the school uniform and are proud to be a part of the community that adheres to that motto. And so you might think, is there a way in which my topic might tie into the school motto, and show them that this is the way that you can bring our school motto to life by doing as I'm about to ask.
Okay, and so where does liking and similarity fit in?
People are most likely to be convinced by somebody if they see that person as being similar to them. And so if I can actually share with you some of my thoughts, my feelings, my beliefs that are in common with you, and I will have identified those in my audience analysis, then you will see me as being more like you, more similar to you. And if you see me that way, then you're more likely to listen to me and be convinced about what I'm going to ask you.
And the last one, of course, authority is quite self-evident. If you can quote from someone that they respect, that will actually help and add to your persuasive presentation. And we'd like to give you an example of how this might work. So there's your key idea. We have to act faster to save our marine environment. And out of those, we might want to use authority, where you quote from a leading marine biologist. Logical appeal, you will use meteorological data, and balance that with emotional appeal of a story of that village in the Pacific, Tuvalu. And so that's how you take those key idea and match it with your support material. You probably wouldn't need any more than 3, as what we are suggesting.
Do not fall into that trap, as we've already mentioned, of not writing a speech but creating a data dump. by overwhelming your audience with too much information. Interestingly, when we've done research on what engages audience, it's not been the amount of information in the speech, it's been the way that the speaker is able to engage them by painting those word pictures and being able to share with them great ideas and great images. And you can't do that if you're trying to rush through a lot of content. You do not get extra mark in this presentation by putting extra material in there and just delivering it more quickly.
This next slide really puts into focus where we've been going and where we're about to go. So on the left-hand side, we talked about defining the audience and defining the task. We've talked about what interests and the motivators, and then we've led into the key statement, the content, and the support material. So it just helps you understand more clearly the way in which this 9-step formula develops. And we now go on to the presentation side of it, the writing of it, and obviously, as we'll see, the speaking. And so that takes us on to step 7.
And with step 7, what you're basically doing is taking what you've got already. So look at what you've got already. You've got a key statement. You've got support material. You've got your call to action. And so you just need to arrange that in the typical format that every presentation needs to have, which is to be able to have an opening, a body, and a conclusion. An opening that gets their attention, a body that holds their attention, and a conclusion that links back to the opening. And with a persuasive speech, you have some additional requirements. In your opening, you should be able to get their attention and appeal to their interests, which you will do with your key statement based on your audience analysis. You need to be able to build on that premise with your persuasive content, which is where you put your support material in the body of the presentation. And then, of course, your call to action provides you with a sharp conclusion that allows you to be able to tell your audience that once you convince them that they need to do something about this, it's very clear to them about what you actually need to do. So you need to organize it into a structure, into a plan. We're going to share with you the plan known as APASAS, which we have put together. It is not important that you use APASAS. That it is not essential. As long as you use a structure which puts your presentation into an opening, a body, and a conclusion, then it may work just as well as APASAS, mightn't it, Adrian?
It certainly might.
It's not essential for you to use APASAS to be able to make this 9-step formula work. If you already have a scaffolding that's been provided that you feel comfortable with, then certainly stick with that, as long as it gives you an attention-getting opening, a body that actually has a flow, and a conclusion that ties back. APASAS, though, follows some logical steps when you're thinking about trying to persuade an audience. You first of all need to be able to get their attention. Answer the question, why should I listen to this? You then tell them what the problem is. Because if we're ever going to look to be able to persuade people, we need to let them know that the world could be better. We need to be able to articulate what the problem is, and how that's actually affecting them. Why they should actually care, why this audience should care about that particular problem. You then let them know what is your proposed solution, how it can be fixed. You put in your support material and your arguments. You may even put in any counter arguments if you need to be able to address any resistance that people might have about why they might not agree with your particular solution. You summarize that and then put it together into the call to action in your conclusion. So you need to start with an opening that's going to work, don't you, Adrian?
Yep. And we'd like to give you a few examples of some great openings that you might be able to use as part of your persuasive speech.
So openings must get the audience's attention. One way that you can actually get the audience's attention is with curiosity. And ways in which you can use curiosity might involve particular things that you say to the audience, or it may involve even an elongated pause. Here's the late, great Steve Jobs with the first 10 seconds, the opening of his most famous speech, the 2007 iPhone launch. And we're going to have to go back. Because what I did was I was sharing screen, remember?
No.
With none of the videos enabled, and forgot that we'd gone straight across into videos. So I need to stop that screen share. Sorry.
That's all right.
So we need to start out with you talking about openings.
And we got record on.
Pardon?
We got record on.
It's all.
Yeah, it's all going.
It's all being.
Okay.
Well, hang on, let me double check. But I think it's still. Yeah, it's still being recorded.
Okay. Good.
So the recording just continues on. I just need to make sure that I do that.
Yeah. Like any speech, it needs to have an attention-getting opening. And there are many ways of doing this. We'd like to share a number of those with you now.
One of those ways is to be able to get the audience's curiosity. And that can be done either verbally with what we say to them, or it might even be done non-verbally with our use of an elongated pause or silence. To be able to show you what I mean by that, I'm going to show you the late, great Steve Jobs using this curiosity opening with one of his greatest speeches, which is the 2007 iPhone launch.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years.
So you can see there, that's the curiosity opening. He starts at the side of the stage. He actually clears his throat to be able to create a sound and get the audience's attention. He allows them to watch him as he takes 7 to 8 seconds to walk to the power position in the center of the stage, and then has a curiosity satisfying opening, which is, this is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years, which then takes the curiosity to a higher level, because people are thinking, if he's been looking forward to this for 2.5 years, it must be something pretty special. Here's Daniel Amen, another very clever speaker, using that technique. Listen to how he does that.
In this talk, I'm going to give you the single most important lesson my colleagues and I have learned from looking at 83,000 brain scans. But first, let me put the lesson into context.
So what he's doing there is promising you, isn't he, Adrian?
Yeah,
promising you, I'm going to share with you this great data, this great research that we have been able to find. But before I share that with you, I need you to be able to understand the context. And so he's promised you something that's coming up, but he's also giving you a reason why you should listen to him as he's giving you the background information. You can then use shock or humor.
Yes. And Muhammad Khatani uses this very effectively in his award-winning Toastmasters speech. And have a look at this and see if you can identify the shock and the humor that he uses.
What? All you all think smoking kills? Let me tell you something. Do you know that the amount of people dying from diabetes are 3 times as many people dying from smoking? Yet if I pulled a Snicker bar, nobody would say anything.
What did you like about that, Kevin?
What I liked about it was, first of all, the originality of grabbing their attention with coming out and pretending to light a cigarette indoors, which for most of us nowadays is absolutely shocking.
Yes.
Cleverly reacts to the audience's reaction with what, as if creates humour, as if he's surprised that they're surprised. And then and later on, when we talk about devices, he actually uses a very clever piece of juxtaposition by actually saying, you'd all be very critical of me lighting up a cigarette, but you wouldn't be so critical if I pulled out a Snickers bar, yet diabetes actually kills more people than smoking does. So I think even in that little 30 or so seconds, you saw some great examples there. What we're going to do now is show you Dhananjaya Hidarachi, and we're actually going to show you how he uses a question to be able to get their attention, and then uses a visual aid to be able to add to his attention-getting presentation.
You and I are not very different from this flower. Just like this flower is unique, you are unique. All of us have something special that makes us as beautiful. Do you know what makes you special? Now the answer to that can be a little difficult to find, because sometimes life has a cruel way of picking out your petals, breaking you in two, and throwing you into the trash. And when you're broken, it's very difficult to feel special.
So, clever example.
Very clever. And very full of a number of techniques that Kevin has suggested work in a presentation.
Doesn't need to be fancy, doesn't need to be big, simple, sometimes can be most effective.
We now move to step 8. And this is where you look at the developing the speech into a spoken format.
The trouble is, in our experience, most speeches that we've seen that have been written by students were meant to be read, they are not meant to be said. We have learned certain rules that English teachers like Adrian have taught us, the rules of grammar, the rules of syntax, the rules of appropriate sentence construction, the rules of what looks good on a page with our arrangement of short and long sentences into paragraphs on the page. All of these are things that we've learned for our written assignments, and they get us good high marks in our written assignments.
They do.
Don't they? But sometimes I think they've created some barriers in allowing us to be able to deliver effective presentations.
You need to understand there is a difference between written and spoken language, and there are a certain number of rules. Let me give you a few of them. Firstly, when we look at the words, 100% of the meaning you get in an assignment comes from what's written down. But in speaking, somewhere in the order of 7%. There's a lot of material that comes from what people are seeing and what they are hearing. So just be aware of that.
Think about how your teachers, think about how your parents say the most important word in your life, your name. Don't you know by the way that they say that name, whether A, maybe this is going to be a pleasant conversation, or B, maybe you wish you were anywhere else in the world. The meaning doesn't come from the word, the meaning comes from how the words are said. And you need to remember that that rule applies just as much when we are delivering presentations.
And language. The language of a written assignment needs to be formal. The language of a spoken assignment can be informal. You can use contractions. You can be a little less formal, more colloquial language. So don't be frightened to use that style of language when you are using speech.
Because if we're trying to create a presentation that sounds, and I think the best way I've heard an effective speaking style nowadays is an enlarged conversation, then the way we converse doesn't fall into those nice, neat paragraphs, does it?
No.
And so you need to make it sound like something that you would say.
Repetition. If you were to write the same phrase or words in an assignment, the teacher would probably tell you to avoid that, get your thesaurus out. However, if you're doing that in a speech, I'd be saying to the student, look, use it, and you put it in a second and a third time, and we have this idea of a triplet, which is a really good technique for making a speech sound more memorable. And as Kevin's mentioned already, that the sounds of a speech are really, really important. No one is ever going to read out your assignment aloud, but you need to make sure that the sounds are interesting, because that's what people are hearing. And if you don't understand that, it just makes for a less effective, persuasive presentation.
I say every word that I'm going to use in a speech aloud before I choose that word to be able to use. As Adrian said, the sounds of the words are irrelevant in a written presentation, but in a spoken presentation, the way a word sounds might cause me to choose one word over another.
And the surroundings, no one really worries at all in terms of the written thing, but in the spoken, it may be possible for you to use and refer to surroundings that are applicable to the point, the persuasion that you are trying to use. Because when you're writing, you're working with words. But when you're speaking, you're working with sounds. And if the sounds aren't interesting, people stop listening. So just take that point on board very, very seriously.
Some of my friends are professional speech writers. It's interesting, Adrian, that I've noticed that they actually use speaking devices, which are very similar to figures of speech that students might already be familiar with.
Oh, right. Well, let's have a look at some of these devices, and I'm sure you will have come across many of them. Alliteration, that repetition of the consonant. PayPal, Coca-Cola. Those are good examples of how you might put alliteration into your speech. Rhyme. Everybody knows what rhyme is, but think about how you might engage an audience through using a couple of rhyming phrases in your speech. It just adds to it. Kevin's already mentioned the way in which metaphors work. Do you want to really just re-emphasize that, Kevin?
Yeah, what you need to do is you need to be able to put images in the audience's mind. For example, I would never say we have problems we have to solve. I would say we have hurdles we need to get over. I would never say, can you please help me? I would say, can you give me a hand? Each time I'm trying to put an image in their mind. And that's what metaphors do, isn't it? Yes. Metaphors, when we say something is something else. Yep. You know, he's a tiger because he's so ferocious. Yep. She's a pussycat because she's so warm and encouraging. And similes is similar. It just uses the word like, doesn't it? It
does indeed. Another device you can use is juxtaposition. This is the idea of using contrast. And it's a very, very easy way to put into your speech. So an example, we could sit here and do something, or we could sit here and do nothing. It's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice. And it's simply taking a word, thinking of the opposite, putting them together in the same sentence so that you juxtapose the words and the ideas. And the last one is triplets. I talked about repetition just recently. Triplets is the idea of groups of three nouns, 3 verbs, 3 adjectives, 3 phrases that you use. And you can even use them in an ascending order, where you say something is important to you, something is important to your school, and something is important to our country. You can also use them in another way, Kevin, couldn't you?
Yeah, well, that's the descending order. So Adrian's gone from small, you, up to a larger a concept of everyone in the country, or you could go in the other direction And if you really want to be able to focus it in on your audience, think of a delivery like this. What I'm asking you to do is important to everyone in this country. It's important to every student in this school. But most of all, it's important to you. And you can see how the triplet has created a cadence there. It allows you to be able to say it in a certain pattern that allows you to be able to deliver it with power, and also have a strong, powerful finish to that final words that you say.
I would encourage you to include those devices in all the speeches that you write. And here's an example of Barack Obama's speech. And you can see Vice President Biden is mentioned in this, and the red becomes triplets, the blue are juxtapositions, and the green a metaphor. And if you look at the next slide where we take those out, you can see there's not a lot left. So it just shows you how important those devices are. I would encourage you to use them in all your speeches. And I want to have a look now at a young Hillary Clinton and see how she uses devices in this short speech that she gave at Beijing.
It is also a coming together, much the way women come together every day in every country. We come together in fields and factories, in village markets and supermarkets, in living rooms and board rooms. Whether it is while playing with our children in the park or washing clothes in a river, or taking a break at the office water cooler, we come together and talk about our aspirations and concerns.
So you see a great example, Adrian, in the first sentence, we see coming together, and then repeated, come together every day in every country. So we've got that repetition there.
I particularly like sentence 2, where you've got fields and factories, alliteration, and then you've got juxtapositioning of village markets and supermarkets and living rooms and boardrooms. What a brilliant sentence.
And every one of those, they're juxtaposed images. Every one of those phrases puts an image in people's minds. And if you think about the fact that there are 2,000 women in this audience that Hillary Clinton was speaking to, if you think about that favorite phrase of Adrian's, it is actually including every woman that would have been in that audience. And even the third sentence is basically a triplet. Again, once you become aware of these devices, you'll recognize how much great speechwriters use them. Even you'll notice editors in newspapers use them in headlines, alliteration and rhyme to be able to get your attention. If it works for them, it will work for you. Use these phrases to be able to write speeches which you can deliver with power and which your audience is most likely to remember. So most people think that writing is just about putting your words into coherent sentences. And as Adrian has already explained to you, it's more than that. First of all, it's taken from the written format, putting it into the spoken format, which is taking those same ideas, but creating shorter sentences using it's not about as a triplet there in the middle of that, that rewriting. But then we still have one further step to go before we consider you've actually finished your writing, which is the marking up, isn't it, Adrian?
Yes, it is. And here is how you might mark up a speech. So you notice how there is bolded, which are words that you want to emphasize. You'll notice there are slashes for pauses and 2 slashes because you want to have a slightly longer pause. And the final thing in the underlining, because that's the final statement and it should be emphasized. We should be leaders. So think about how you might do that for your speeches and mark it up.
Decide which words will be emphasized. Decide where you're going to put pauses. Decide where you're going to speak more quickly and where you're going to speak more slowly.
I talked about the vocal aspect of a speech being very, very important. And so let's work our way through some of the vocal techniques that you need to use in your persuasive. So volume, Kevin.
Yep, the volume at which we speak is really important. Now, if you're speaking to an audience live in the room, you need to be obviously clearly heard at the back of the room. If you're doing your presentation into a recorded format, when you're speaking to a microphone, obviously it needs to be clear enough, but also you can probably make use of a wider range of volume, because I can actually drop my voice down to almost a whisper, and will actually add variety to my presentation. It's almost like I'm sharing a secret with you. So I can get louder or I can get softer. And it's simply the change in the sound that makes it more interesting, doesn't it, Adrian?
Yes, it certainly does. And the next is the rate of speech. Now, 135 words per minute is approximately the rate at which people speak, but you would not speak at that level because it would become boring and monotonous. The way in which you get to an average of 135 is to go parts of the speech at 180 words per minute and parts of the speech that go at 80 words per minute. And so you make the decision. And Kevin has a couple of ideas about how you might use this different rate.
Yeah, generally, the golden rule is faster for context, the background information, slower for content, like your key statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But don't make it all delivered at the same rate, please. It will make it really hard for people to pay attention. And you may have written a great speech, but if you make it not sound interesting, it's not going to be appreciated by anybody, because they won't be listening.
Tone of voice is what conveys emotion. And obviously in a persuasive speech, you want to convey emotion to people because you want to move them to accept your position on some topic. And so you need to think about how you might do that.
And if you want your audience to care about something, you have to sound like you care. If you want them to be upset about something, you have to sound like you're upset. If you want them to be excited about something, you have to sound excited.
Articulation, just make sure you say all the syllables of every word. Don't be a lazy speaker.
Inflection is the way our voice goes up or down at the end of a sentence. Now, if we're asking the audience a question, it's quite logical for our voice to go up at the end. However, if we regularly have our voice go up at the end of every sentence, it becomes very difficult to convince the audience that we know what we're talking about. The great thing about inflection is that a falling inflection can work to our advantage. And so if I say a statement with a falling inflection at the end, people will automatically assume that that's a statement of authority. The way that you use your voice is really important is a question. The way that you use your voice is really important becomes a statement of authority. So make sure that when you're saying your key statement, it is said with a falling inflection at the end.
And emphasis, as we showed you in that previous slide, make sure you have some way in which you can emphasize certain words, color coding, underlining, whatever works for you, because emphasis does work. And pause. Now, a pause is the speaker's exclamation mark. In all my years of teaching students, I've never had to tell a student that their pauses were too long. So it gives you some indication that we need to put pauses in, and the pause needs to be at least 2.5 seconds long. Because if it's less than that, people don't realize that you've paused. They just think you're clearing your voice, thinking about the next bunch of words you want to get there. So put your pauses in and make sure you have 2 or 3 slashes behind them so you know you should slow down and pause for at least 2.5 seconds.
The best way you can do this is use one of the preparatory tools that you all have in your bag or in your pocket, and that is your phone. Use the camera on your phone to record your presentation. I recommend that when you are practicing your presentation, when you think you've actually lost your way, don't stop immediately and go back to your notes, but try and push through. You will notice about half the time you'll be able to. The other half of the time it won't come to you and you'll need to go and check your notes. But when you look back at and listen back to your recording, you will actually notice that a lot of the times when you thought that you lost your way and it would have been really obvious to the audience that it wasn't, because it took you less than 2 seconds to be able to get back on track again. I think this is a great reminder to students that, number one, we don't pause for long enough, but also most of the time when we lose our way, it's not obvious to the audience. And most students worry about it much more than they should. If you're putting it all together, you'll end up with that modality that I mentioned before, Adrian, isn't it?
Yes,
Which is an enlarged conversation. Yeah.
Mm.
And a confident speaker, regardless of the size of the audience, looks like they're just having a conversation with their audience.
The visual aspect of a speech is also an important one. And here are some of the things that you need to consider. Dress and grooming. Just make sure and check before you get up to speak that everything is as it should be.
You're communicating with your audience a long time before you say your first word. The second they lay eyes on you, you're actually communicating with them.
Posture and stance. Be very aware of how you stand and how you address an audience.
If you're going to be standing in front of an audience, you need to be in what's called a speaker neutral stance, which is just standing upright, imagining a little wire coming out of the top of your head, almost like you're a puppet, pulling it up as tall as you can possibly be. Your feet are about shoulder distance apart. Your toes are pointing slightly out. Your weight is evenly balanced on both feet. That's the most important point. And your hands are at your sides. If you start that way, then you will have the most chance of appearing confident to the audience, and you also use that stance for whenever you are delivering your key statement, don't you?
Yes,
Adrian. Now, if you're going to be delivering to camera, you may be standing up, you may be sitting down. You need to decide based on what's available to you about what camera frame you will use. Will you show just a head and shoulders shot like you're seeing of Adrian and I at the moment? Will you maybe pull it back a little bit and be able to see an upper body shot where more of your gestures might be visible to the audience? Are you able to maybe even show a full body shot where they can see you standing up? If you're going to be delivering sitting down, use that same principle as we mentioned before with when you're standing up, feet flat on the floor, and make sure that you are sitting up straight, and that appears confident to the audience when you're delivering from a seated position. Think about the framing, think about your lighting if you're going to be presenting to camera, because that is all part of the visual message that you are sharing with your audience.
Gestures. You need to include some gestures in your speech. Now, this doesn't have to be like a prepared drama performance or anything like that, but you need to include gestures that are appropriate to what you are saying. And here's a little hint. Plan a gesture for the first 10 seconds of your speech. What it does is it gets the body moving, it makes you feel more comfortable, and for those first 15 to 20 seconds of your speech go well, it's very likely that the rest of the speech will also go well. Movement, depending on the room where you're delivering and what style of delivery, because Kevin's already mentioned if you're doing it to camera, there's no right or wrong amount of movement in a speech. It's just what feels right to you. If you're the person that likes to stand in front of an audience steady and still, that's fine. If you like to move in your speech, that's fine too. Kevin actually has a rule or two about movement.
Yeah, if you are going to be standing still, make sure you stand in the middle of the speaking position. If you are going to be moving around, make sure you come back to that middle position for your opening, for your key statement, and for your conclusion. Move around equally, left and right side of the audience in between those times if you want, but you come back to that what's called the power position in the middle of the stage to be able to deliver the key parts of your presentation.
And Kevin also has some interesting observations about facial expression.
It's really simple. Just make sure that your facial expression matches your tone of voice. None of these happens in isolation. It's a cluster of our tone of voice and our facial expression, our body movement. It might even involve a head tilt or a shoulder shrug, everything that makes it more interesting, lively, and natural to your audience.
Eye contact. This does not mean you have to look at every person in the audience and engage with them. It may be you pick out 3 or 4 people only whom you want to speak to, and one of those may be your teacher because they most likely give you positive feedback. And so think about eye contact in that nature. It may be 2 or 3 different parts of the room, but that's all you do. And if you don't feel comfortable in the course of your 5 to 8 minute speech, just stay with those 3 or 4.
It's an optical illusion you create. You see, if I'm speaking to a room full of about 26 students, and I look at one student from the front of the room, then the 3 students sitting behind them, the 2 students sitting either side of them, and the 1 student sitting in front of them will think I'm making eye contact with them as well. You don't have to make eye contact with everyone in the room. And in fact, sometimes it's best to avoid making eye contact with your best friend who you played a practical joke on at lunchtime, because they might not be able to resist that temptation to use that as an opportunity to get even with you. You've seen that, haven't you, Adrian?
I certainly have seen it many times.
If you're going to be speaking to camera, remember that your eye contact is not your eye contact with the vision of you on the screen. Your eye contact is with the camera. You need to be looking down the barrel. That's how you create eye contact when you're delivering in a virtual environment, by making eye contact directly to the camera. Then when people are looking at the video, it will appear that you're making direct eye contact with them.
And visual aids, you've seen a few examples of what we've given you. It may be possible for you to incorporate visual aids within your persuasive speech.
Because as well as painting word pictures in your mind, if you can show them a powerful emotive image, that might just be the tipping point that's going to be able to get them on your side for your particular persuasive requirement.
Let's talk about notes.
Because no matter how much students agree that I shouldn't be reading to my audience, if you do read to your audience, you can be assured that there's not going to be any words left out. You're not going to have any mind blanks. You're not going to be maybe as nervous because you're not worried about having a mind blank or leaving things out. But you also need to be aware of what your impact is on the audience. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to put them to sleep because it's going to be boring. Your fellow students, your peers, your classmates are people that you do not want to bore. Do not read to them. Reading to them will compromise whatever possible mark you can get from your teacher, but will also waste your fellow students' time by boring them.
Notes. The notes that you see on the screen now are ones that I've seen so many times, and they're too small and they're very hard for someone to look down, find where they should be, look up because they know they're supposed to do it, and it just doesn't work. And then some people also go with the modality of palm cards, and they don't only have one palm card, they have a whole host of them. And the problem with palm cards is, again, too small. People remember more than they think they do, and by the time they need to consult their palm cards, it's number 4, and becomes like a Where's Wally exercise when they look down at their palm cards. So please, let's think about it. Here's an idea that you might want to try. Here's a script fully written by one of my students. So what I then asked them to do is make it 20 font size. And so there it happens. And then I say to them, I want you to go to the end of each sentence and press enter twice. So what you've got now, every sentence is there in a clear way. You've still got too many words in some of the one sentences. So your next step is to actually try and reduce what's there by using abbreviations, by taking things out. And we see on the next slide that instead of saying, what does friendship mean to you? We've taken out what does, but for you, you'll know what to put in. And the dashes indicate there are some small words left out, the ands and the buts and the who's and that sort of thing. So have a think of that. And then, as I've suggested, you put in color coding, you use bolding, you try all those devices we've talked about to make it meaningful to you. And then finally, you end up with putting in a G where you want to indicate gestures. The other thing that you might try is using that modality there where we use color coding and we don't put any ideas there, but there's a speech with just images. So notice the conclusion are the only words are there. And the reason for that, of course, is that the last thing the teacher's going to hear is conclusion. And that needs to be the thing that you learn most. The modality of mind maps, Kevin.
Yeah, the great Tony Buzan created mind maps because that's the way our minds work. And if that's the way our minds work, then maybe that's the way in which you should feed your minds with the information. Main point, when you lose your way in a presentation, your mind does not need words. You're looking for the next phrase or sentence you're going to say. But finding that does not help you because you say that one phrase or sentence and then you're back in the same horrible place you were 10 seconds ago. What you need is an idea. Your notes should always be a train of thought, because if they are a train of thought, when you lose your way, if you get the next idea, you will be able to put words around it.
Okay.
Sometimes, we're now using, people want to use a full script. And here's one way in which you might be able to use a option, a tool that's already available to you in Microsoft Word.
If you want to use a full script for practicing or even for delivering your presentation, then auto scroll in Microsoft Word can be a very useful tool. To be able to use auto scroll, you first of all need to set up your document correctly. I have set up the first 130 or so words from the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln for auto scrolling. You'll see I've actually made it 30-point font size. I've used double line spacing in those passages that need to be delivered more slowly. I've taken away the margins at the top and the bottom of the page, and the opening starts about a third of the way down the first page. I have used bolding, underlining, and different colors to be able to highlight phrases that need to be emphasized. I've used slashes 1, 2, and 3 to be able to indicate pauses of different lengths. And I've put in a little graphic to be able to remind me when I need to do gestures. Now, most issues on Microsoft Word don't have auto scroll enabled as a default, and so you need to do that. And so to do that, I'll go to File, Options, Quick Access Toolbar, and then I will choose Commands from Commands Not in the Ribbon. If I look a little bit further down, I'll actually find an option called Auto Scroll, and I'll add that to the box on the right-hand side, and then click OK. When I go back to my Word document, I'll now notice there's a little icon up there in the top left-hand corner, the round icon, that's Auto Scroll. So to be able to use that for Auto Scroll, I'll bring the document back up to full size. I'll enable Auto Scroll, and you'll actually see an up and down arrow appear. And the direction that I move that arrow determines the direction in which the text moves. And how far I move the arrow determines how fast the text moves. And so what I'll do is I'll take this just across to when the arrow is actually moving down, move it a little bit further to make it a little bit faster. And what I'll get there is about 135 words per minute. I can read from the middle of the page, and it will feed me the text at exactly the right rate. This can be particularly useful for those students who tend to find themselves speaking too quickly. Auto scroll in Microsoft Word can be a very, very useful tool.
Adrian, you actually were telling me about a student that used this.
Because they spoke too quickly, and by forcing them to slow down, it enabled them to get the A that they were really should have got, but didn't because of their speed. So it could even be used in that particular sequence.
So whilst we never recommend using a full script for your entire presentation, if you want to use it for practice, that can be really helpful. And if you feel you must, then there are also other teleprompting options available to you. There are on the screen there. There's Q Prompter, where you can actually feed the script to yourself at a certain rate, or there is Teleprompt Me, which is a free program. Doesn't always work as smoothly as it should, but it will actually feed you the words based on the rate at which you are delivering them.
So now we come to step 9. Now, although we've got 9 steps in our program, you wouldn't spend exactly the same amount of time on all 9 steps. In fact, 8 and 9 probably would take you a lot more time to get involved, to write it, to think about it, to practice it, and then that. So in step 9,
You need to be able to practice it. You need to be able to practice it in a way that's going to allow you to be able to deliver it most confidently. And as I mentioned at the start of this seminar, you should not practice it in the same order in which you will be delivering it. If you do that, for most people, they will have practiced the opening 30 times and probably only made it to the conclusion once.
Yes.
You need to be working towards the part of the presentation you know best, not away from the part of the presentation you know best. And so our suggestion to you is try not to practice it in one big bite. Break it up into chunks. The opening is a chunk. The conclusion is a chunk. The different parts of the body of your presentation are separate chunks. And then make sure that you know the final chunk best. Make sure the most powerful, most confident delivery that you have in your entire presentation actually happens in the conclusion when you are delivering your all-important call to action. And just to reinforce, in those 9 steps, if, for example, a student had 2 weeks from notice of the start of this task to when they have to actually deliver it, I would suggest, Adrian, that they should have step 7 completed at least by the first week, shouldn't they?
Yes, that's certainly what we would suggest.
Yeah, don't assume that you can leave it right until the very last minute, because this last step is what's going to really take you from a middle range mark to the top mark. That's what adds the polish to your presentation. So that concludes the seminar. Hopefully we've given you ideas in which you can be able to put together a persuasive oral which is going to get you the best mark that you deserve.
Good luck for your persuasive oral.
Thank you and goodbye.